This is a wonderful story, full of things to capture our imagination, rich in happenings and moments and characters and actions for us to think about. In one sense, this man through the roof is a picture of the whole gospel. A man from the world above breaks through into our world to make forgiveness manifest on the earth. And that's what the gospel story tells us. Jesus, the man from above, breaks through the barriers of sin and death in order to bring forgiveness to the whole world. Isn't that enough to be thinking about? Maybe I should stop there. But there's more. What we miss is that this was Jesus' home. Verse 21 says that the people heard that he'd come home. He'd moved to Capernaum some time before because Capernaum was the most densely populated economic trading centre of the region. There was so much opportunity to tell the good news of the kingdom there. And if this was Jesus' home, that means that straight away there's a cost to the forgiveness he brings. There's tiles to be put back, insulation to fit, plastering to be done. Son, your sins are forgiven was never going to be just words. In the end, there was a life to be given, a death to die. Jesus being at home was never a retreat from the world. It was a deep engagement with the world. So what cost forgiveness in my house? What repair work will I do in order to live well with my parents, with my wife, my children? Will I bear the cost of someone breaking through the roof, or at least coming through the front door, into my space in order to find the forgiveness they need? Is their forgiveness before God more important than my space? The crowd evidently liked to hear the good news. They gathered in such numbers that there was no room, not even outside the door. People gather where there's good news, and Jesus being at home was good news. Maybe we forget that sometimes. Maybe we gather to worship thinking we're doing God a favour, forgetting that worship is God's gift to us, his invitation for us to spend time in his presence, to be at home with him. Maybe when we gather we hope that God will somehow turn up, forgetting that we gather because God's already in the house, present and at home. And when I go to worship, am I one who stands at the back of the crowd, perhaps not even seeing, catching a word or two? Or will I press in, work my way through the crowd, break through the roof in order to lay down what concerns me at Jesus' feet? It's easier to stay at the back of the crowd. It's safe and anonymous. But Jesus saw their faith when he looked up and saw them looking through the hole in the roof that they had dug. And he said to the man on the stretcher, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Jesus didn't deal with the crowd. He dealt with them and with him. And he was someone probably most of us wouldn't deal with. We may have thought that his condition was his own fault. Jesus forgave his sins after all. or that he was an embarrassment that shouldn't be seen in public, an encumbrance for whom making space was just too much trouble. He might even be a fire risk if you put him down there in the middle of all those people. Or is he the very one that Jesus wants to see and deal with? Is it him because he's unable to help himself? He's the alcoholic, the drug addict, or the person with learning difficulty who's at the back of the crowd and who everyone has turned their backs on. And is his outward paralysis a reflection of what's hidden in me? That I can't forgive someone because of what they've done to me, because they're better than me, because they're different to me, because they think different things to me? Or is it that I can't forgive myself because of what I've done or who I am or how I look? That I'm afraid of looking silly or being wrong or just being unable? What sins would Jesus forgive if he looked at me and said, "Son, your sins are forgiven"? His friends and that stretcher carrying him up the town to Jesus. And when they get there and they find their way blocked, they find another way. Up the stairs to the roof. And when the roof's in the way, they break through. Didn't Jesus say, since the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force? Faith isn't passive in the face of evil in the world. Nobody, no thing was going to stop these men from laying their friend at Jesus' feet. And when Jesus looked up and saw their faith, he saw a concerned faith, concerned for their friend that he should find healing. Not a self-indulgent faith all about themselves, but faith that puts somebody else more important. And he saw a convinced faith, convinced that Jesus would help. Not faith for something, but faith in someone. And he saw a committed faith. They didn't just stand there and pray. They gave their prayers some hands and feet. They carried him up the town, up those steps, in order to lay him down at Jesus' feet. So who is on my stretcher of faith? Whose friend am I? Who is it that I would bear up in my prayers to Jesus? Who is it that I would break down every obstacle for in order to lay them at the feet of Jesus? If Jesus were to look at me, would he see my concerned, convinced and committed faith that isn't just words? One thing I know is that Jesus isn't just words. He did use words, and his words were powerful. Son, your sins are forgiven. Very powerful words if you're looking for forgiveness. But I rather think that the man through the roof wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for a pair of legs that worked. And that's when the grumbling started. How can they know if the forgiveness of sins has worked? That's God's domain after all. That's what the grumblers were saying. Who can forgive sins except God alone? And that's right. Only God can forgive sins. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and saying. And so he says a remarkable thing. Which is easier? To say, son, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take up your mat and go home? I've thought a lot about that, and it's not easy to answer. It's easy to say your sins are forgiven because you can't see any difference. But it's hard to say, take your mat and go home, because if it doesn't work, you look a fraud. But then again, to say your sins are forgiven is harder, because you put yourself in the place of God. And who would do that? Unless you are God. Maybe the question should be, which is easier to do? Forgive sins or heal the man from his paralysis? Jesus did both. And perhaps for Jesus, healing the man was easier than forgiving sins, because in the end it cost him his life to do that. But perhaps for us, because the forgiveness of Jesus has come to us and we have his forgiveness in us, maybe it's easier for us to forgive sins. But then if we could learn to do that, perhaps it would release the power in us to heal as well. Jesus was at home that day, and he made his home a place of forgiveness and healing. And we can do the same in our own home.